Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and so far in our Magic and Chess series, we've got our Magic working great, our spell hotbar is also functional. However, it's kind of lame that we have to always pick up scrolls on the map, and I'd like to add some treasure chests to pop them out. We're going to make the scrolls pop up in the air. We're also going to add support so that you can have multiple spells in one chest. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is just clean up this scene a little bit. I'm just going to click these loot prefabs here and delete them. I'm also going to grab this training dummy, and we've never made him into a prefab, so let's just drag that down into our prefab folder so that we've got him saved for later, and then we can delete all the training dummies from this scene. Next, we want to get started on our chest. So let's go ahead and head into our sprites. We're going to use the medieval castle pack, go to decorations, animated decorations, and there's a folder here for chests. Now, we're just going to shift click each of these, set our pixels per unit to 16, make sure that we are on point no filter, and then use 32-bit as our format. We'll apply those changes, and then we're almost ready to animate, except that they're currently set to a multiple sprite mode. Just shift that to single and apply those changes as well. At this point, we can now just drag the first chest up into our hierarchy. I'm going to rename this one as chest, and then just drag it into place on my map. I'm going to put my animation pane just up above here so I can see all my sprites below, and then with my chest selected, I'll hit create. Next, I'll head to my assets folder, click on animations, and we'll call this one chest open. I'm just going to begin by shift clicking each of the 5 chests. We don't need the damaged one. And then I'm just going to repeat the final frame so that it lasts a little longer. We'll then select all of these, drag them out over about half a second, and that's looking pretty decent. I'm then just going to search chest here and grab my chest open animation, as I want to make sure that it is not in fact looping. We can now hide our animation pane, head up to the animator, and at the moment it's going to open the chest by default, so let's just right click, create a new state. We can call this one idle, and then we'll right click it and set that as our default so that it only opens if we actually explicitly tell it to in our code. Now we just want to make it so the chest can actually detect our player, so let's add a box collider. And then we'll just change its size so that it's a little larger than the chest itself. With that done, we're actually ready to script, but first let's just go to our assets folder and open up our input system. I'm going to be setting mine up to use this move input so that whenever I press up, it opens the chest, but I'll also show how you can use a different button, like say the interact button, which for me is set to E. Alright. Once you've decided on which button you're going to be using, let's head back out of here. We can now create a new script, and we're going to call this one chest. Let's begin by getting rid of the start and update method, and now we're just going to need a couple of references. The first will be a serialized private animator reference, which we'll just call anim. And then we're also going to need a way for our chest to know when the player is pushing a button. So we're just going to make a private reference to our player input. And in order for that to work, we'll just have to add the namespace using UnityEngine.InputSystem. Finally, we want a way to track whether the chest has been opened so we can't loot it over and over again, so let's make a private bool for isOpened. Now we want to detect when the player comes in range, so we'll use a private onTriggerEnter method. And here we just want to check to see if the thing that's entered the trigger is in fact the player. We're going to do this with an if statement where we check the collision. And here we're going to use a new code we haven't used in this series yet called try_get_component, which is simply going to do what the name suggests. It's going to try and get the player input component, and if it does, it's going to pass out that variable and store it here in this variable called input. So now we can talk to the player input system by using this input name. Now then, if we actually find a player input, we're just going to fill this script's reference to player input with whatever we found and stored in that input spot. We'll then just copy and paste this entire method, change it to onTriggerExit, and make it so that whenever the player leaves, we nullify the reference to player input, so the chest can no longer be opened. We'll first do a quick check to see if the input that just left is the same as the one that this script is already holding on to, and if so, we'll just nullify it. Okay, now that our script knows if the player's in range and has a reference to his input system if he is in range, we can now start an update method where we're going to check for specific inputs. So first of all, if the chest is already opened, or if we have no reference to player input, meaning the player's not nearby, we're just going to return. We don't need our update method to fire any further. However, if those things are not true, then we want to move ahead. We'll do the press up method first. So here we're going to make a vector2 called moveInput, and it's just going to store the player's input. And here the action we want to look at is that one called move. Specifically, we want to read the value, which is a vector 2, and just store it in our move input. Now we'll just constantly check to see if the move input's y is greater than 0.1, and if it is, then we'll just tell our animator that it needs to play its open chest animation. Just make sure you're using the exact same name as the state here in your animator. All right, now that we've got that done, I'll just show the other option, which is how to open this with a button press, like say interact. So our other option is just simply to check if the player input on the action of interact was pressed this frame. Now, if in fact we'd pressed interact in this last frame, then again we'll tell our anim to play chest open. And in fact, we can actually leave both of these at the same time, and it'll just give us the ability to use either to open chests, or you can pick one that you prefer. Back in Unity, make sure to add the chest component to our chest, and then make sure that it has a reference to its own animator. We'll then go to the box collider and make sure that it's set as a trigger. Go to our sprite renderer and make sure that it is in a lower layer than the player so that it appears behind him. I'm going to go with -1. At this point, we can duplicate our chest and drag it open so that I can try both inputs. First, I'll try pressing up, and looks like it works. And with my interact key, also working nicely. All right, let's actually get some loot in here. All right, so to do that, we're going to pop back into our chest script, and we're going to need a reference to a collectible SO that we want to get from this chest. We're going to start with just one, then we'll upgrade it later to be able to drop multiple. You may remember that collectible SO serves as a sort of parent script to our spell SO, and later it will for our item SO as well. And it just holds a bunch of variables that every type of collectible we'll have in our game will need. By using it here in the chest, we enable ourselves to be able to drop any spells, items, armors, or any other type of collectible we may create in the future from this chest. So now that our chest has all of the data it needs from the collectible SO, it's also going to need a generic game object for the loot prefab that it can apply that data to. One last thing we're going to add, and that is just that I want a slight delay after we open the chest before the item appears. That way we can actually watch the chest open and then have the item pop out. This is just going to be a float called spawn delay. Now, because we're wanting to add a delay and use time, we're going to put this into a coroutine, so we'll make a private enumerator called open chest routine. Remember, a coroutine is much like a method except that it can be paused. Now, it's not going to like that at first, and in my IDE I can right click and go to quick actions and refactorings, and then it'll show me the namespace that I need to add. If yours doesn't do that, you'll just have to pop up top and add using system.collections. So inside the coroutine, the first thing we want to do is just let our chest know it's open so we don't reopen it. Then, rather than call anim.play chest open in both of our instances up top, we can just copy it once down here, and instead, whenever we open the chest, whether by move input or interaction, we want to call this open chest routine. So now, right after we tell our chest to play its animation, we just want to wait for our spawn delay so that it has time to finish the animation, and then we're ready to pop out the item. For this, we're going to instantiate our loot prefab, and we essentially just want to do it at the position of this chest. There's no special rotation needed, so we can just put quaternion.identity, and now we've got a generic loot prefab popping up, but it doesn't have any identity. So we're going to need to actually talk to its loot component. To do this, we'll just turn this instantiate into a reference, and it's just going to store the object we're instantiating, though we do have to, at the end, get component and actually grab the loot component off of that. Now we can talk to this component by just using the new loot phrase, and we're going to ask it to initialize and pass along the collectible SO that we want it to use for that initialization. Now that method doesn't exist yet, so for this we're going to pop into our loot script and create a new public void method called initialize that takes in a collectible SO. The first thing this is going to do is just store the collectible SO we've passed in its own reference. And then we're going to want to change the sprite associated with this prefab. So up top, we need a reference to our sprite renderer. We'll call it SR. And now then in initialize, we can use the sprite renderer and tell it that its new sprite is going to be equal to our collectible SOs. And here we run into another problem, as at the moment, our collectible doesn't actually have like an in-map sprite. It just has an icon to appear in our hotbar. So we're going to head to our collectible SO to add that. Here then we'll just quickly make a public sprite reference to the item sprite we want to use. Now then, when we get back to Unity, we can just actually type in the name of one of our spells. I'm going to use Spark, and it now has a spot to put in its item sprite. I'm just going to be using scrolls for each of these, and I'm just going to pick either scroll 1 or 2 since we only have the 2. And I think I will give our healing ones a blue scroll and use the red for Spark, but you can do whatever you like. At this point then, we can open up our loot prefab. and just make sure to drag its own sprite, which has the sprite renderer, into that SR box. Then when we exit our prefab, we can actually click on the chest itself and make sure that we fill in both its loot prefab as well as give it a collectible SO. I'll do this for both chests. And now when we get in the game, we can open them up and see that they have in fact picked different scrolls and that when I collect them, they know which item they're supposed to be. That said, we've got a couple of problems here. First of all, the popping of the items out of the chests is a little underwhelming. We want to animate this a little bit. Additionally, if the player's standing directly over the chest, you don't really even see the item appear, we just all of a sudden collect it. And I want to have it have just a little delay so you can actually see the item first. Now before we jump into our code, let's open up the loot prefab, and we're just going to add a rigid body component so that it can actually have some gravity to fall down after it pops up in the air. Now we've already got a circle collider here set as a trigger so that we can detect when the player enters this item, but we're also going to need another collider, one that we set a little bit smaller, which will just cause it so that when it falls after popping out of the chest, it actually lands on the ground. With that done, we're ready to head back into our chest script. So we're going to add one more variable here. This one will be a float for our launch force. I'm just going to start it at 4, though we'll play with different numbers in the inspector later. Now we're going to use physics to pop this into the air, so we're going to need a reference to our rigid body. To do this, we're just going to grab our new loot object and just get the component of the rigid body right off it. Now we can just get our rigid body and add a force to it. Here we'll have it go in a direction, we'll define that in just a second, and multiply it by our launch force. We can also pick what mode we want. We're going to use force mode 2D.impulse. And now we just need to calculate our direction. This is going to be a vector 2, and we're going to calculate it at runtime, so we'll have to make it a new vector 2. The x will be a random range, somewhere between -0.5 and +0.5. And for the y, we want it to always go upwards, so we'll just put a 1 there. We're then going to normalize this value, and then we're ready to test. Alright, now when we get in here, there's a couple problems. First, the push of the item actually pushes the player. We're going to fix that in a later episode when we update some things with our player controller. However, it's also very weak. I'm going to try 16, but you'll notice that that is also problematic. It gives it a nice push up, but then it floats away forever. And this really just comes down to tweaking. I'm going to head into my rigid body and try giving it some more weight, perhaps 8. And then for launch force, I'm going to try something like 30. That's better, but still has some issues. So let's go to our loot prefab's rigid body now, and just at the bottom in our constraints, make sure that we freeze rotation so it doesn't spin. Additionally, let's pop back into our script here and just change the variance for the x value to maybe -2 and +2 so it's not shooting off so far to the side. Now that looks like it's working much better, except that when I try the second one here, the gravity is so heavy that it goes down into the ground. We can fix that by going into our loot prefab one more time and then just on our rigid body, changing our collision detection to continuous, and it'll make sure that it detects the ground properly. Alright, that's looking a lot better. There is still some potential for problems. I'll let you tweak how much you want those to move on your own and get it just right for you. Next up, we want to make it so the player doesn't auto-collect items the second they pop out of a chest. To do this, we'll just make a bool called can be collected, which will default to false, meaning we can't collect it yet. We're then just going to add one more serialized private float here. This one will be for the delay before it becomes collectible. That way, as soon as we initialize an item, we'll start a coroutine called enable collection. This is just going to be an IEnumerator of that same name. Don't forget to add using system.collections. And all we're going to do here is simply wait for our collect delay, and then set can be collected to true. Now the other thing we need to do is make sure that we're actually gating the ability to collect this based on whether or not it's ready to be collected. So in our onTriggerEnter, we'll make it so that if player is null, meaning if the player is not nearby, or can be collected is false, then we return, not making it possible for us to collect the item unless both those things actually check out. Now when we look at our loot prefab, you'll notice can be collected is turned off, as it should be, and we can just give it a collect delay. Let's try something like 0.5 seconds. Now when we test, even if the player is standing right over it, the item does pop up just fine, and it becomes collectible on its way back down. Again, it is pushing the player out of the way. Don't worry, in our very next video, we're going to add some fixes to our player controller and we'll take care of that then. Now the last thing that I want to do is make it so that we can collect multiple types of loot from a single chest if we want. So we're going to take this single collectible SO reference and turn it into a list of collectible SOs instead. However, our code won't like that. We need to add using system.collections.generic for list to work. We're going to call this loot table, as it's going to be a table of loot, and we'll initialize it as a new empty list of collectible SOs. Now then, when we open our chest, instead of just automatically spawning in one collectible, we're going to use a for each loop here. Here we'll simply loop through every collectible SO, let's just give them the name loot, that happen to be in our loot table, and we're going to want to instantiate them one by one. For this we can just copy all of our code below for spawning and popping them up in the air. The main difference now is just that we're going to be using the name loot from our for each loop here, since collectible SO is no longer the name of our single loot that we're spawning. The one other thing I want to do here is just add a brief pause after each item spawns so that they don't all pop up at the exact same time and get lost together, but one after another pops into the air. We can do this by just at the end of the loop before it loops back up to the top, telling it that we want to yield, and we'll use wait for seconds here and just pass in our spawn delay, which is like 0.2 seconds or something like that. Now when we look at our chest, we have this loot table instead of a single collectible. I'm gonna make it so that my first one spawns one of each type of magic, and then I'll just click on my second chest and just have it spawn a single item so we can see how both work. Now when we get in the game, we can open up the chest, and there we go, one after another the items pop up in the air, and the single one still works as it did before. Alright, I hope you found this one helpful. This wraps up our Magic and Spells series for now. In our next video, we're actually going to look at how to improve this player controller to fix some of the things like that idle bump we're getting and some slight issues with jumping and that sort of thing. Hope to see you in that video. Until then, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.